Okay, hi everybody. This is our season finale of Fliplanthropy. We've been trying to flip the script on philanthropic thinking for the past weeks. And this last session is on pathways to Philanthro-Radicalisation, more radical, root-oriented thinking when it comes to holding or redistributing money. And we also have the pleasure of our speaker being somebody who's intimately involved with Querida Foundation, part of our funder circle, and also part of a longstanding collaboration and journey and knowledge exchange for some years, and a radical philanthropic practitioner, Marlene Engelhorn, who's been making quite some waves in homeland of Austria and beyond. And I will actually allow Marlene to speak about her journey and process and practice. It's a lot better from the source. So pathways to philanthro-radicalization. Marlene.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited that I get to talk to a lot of people who are interested in this particular kind of work. Thanks for the introduction. I'm really nervous. I always am. I need to say it, and then I usually feel a little better. Okay, so journey. Frankly, journeys have like this start and ending kind of narrative arc, and I really don't have it because there was a lot of stuff that I did before I knew anything about anything. And it also informed how I plunged into this. It's more like I got to some water and then it was about to be about to get wet. And how was I going to enter that water? Was it going to be dipping a toe in and then slowly like getting accustomed, or did I just full on jump in? And I kind of am the person who full on jumps into things and then figures out how to swim instead of learning and then doing things in a strategic and systematic order. So the way I approach things might not be for everybody, but maybe a few things might be inspiring to some of you. My approach was basically when I realized I was going to inherit an enormous amount of wealth, I knew that I couldn't keep it because it's incredibly unjust and it shouldn't have been mine to begin with, because the privilege of birth is something that in a democracy should be abolished completely, or at least regulated to the point of being irrelevant. And when I knew that I was going to be so super duper rich, I started annoying everyone around me with questions of how to address this and what to do. And nobody had a super answer. I got the classical answers like classic philanthropy and impact investing, and I was not believing any of it, because a very important question that I couldn't phrase at the time, but I still carried already, was about power dynamics and how they were reproduced and what role would I be in if I did not take into account these power dynamics and the privilege patterns that formed me. Luckily though, because I'm a rich kid, I am connected to rich kids very, very easily. Everybody seems to know everybody or have a number that you can call in order to know someone who knows someone. And that's how I got to meet Tony, who was the first funder of the Querida Foundation, who introduced me to Romy, who then was managing director. And that got me the internship with the Querida Foundation, where I got to learn from a very intimate perspective, without any decision-making power whatsoever, what this idea of participatory grant making and philanthropy could be about when it wasn't about replicating power dynamics, and what it meant to also enter a process of changing existing power dynamics in order to get closer to a participatory model, a democratic model, where everybody involved in the work was allowed to voice and shape how this work should be done, instead of having the classical hierarchy of donors telling funders what to do, who tell grantees what to do. At the same time, I also, because I don't do things one after the other, I started doing the media work with Tax Me Now, finding other people with wealth aligned around tax justice questions, using our privilege again to enter the public speaking sphere where we get listened to just because we're rich people. Nothing else. We don't even need to do much. We just needed to launch that there is this initiative, and all of a sudden we couldn't help ourselves but get one media request after the other. The kind of public attention that so many great organizations would never even get if they did the perfectest of work. And we just got it because we were rich people. So we also used this role that we have as privileged rich people to talk as privileged rich people about tax justice, that we can pay them, that we need to pay taxes, that there is a possibility of changing the system through existing democratic tools such as taxation. All that while I was learning about participatory grant making. I also wrote a book on money that will not tell you anything new, I suppose, so I'm not going to make any advertising thing about it. But just so you know, like I was doing it fully, completely, and I was falling on my nose a lot. I will never forget when I told Romy back then, and also in a various team check-ins voice, like internal considerations around maybe I should have a foundation of my own, blah, 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 and like replicate maybe the Greer Foundation model, whatever. And I think Romy once literally said to me, "Nobody has waited for you, Marlene." And she didn't mean it in a way to destroy my confidence or annihilate my inspiration for participating in change, but she said it because she wanted to make very clear, and because she trusted me to be able to hold this conversation as much as she trusted herself to hold the conversation with me, that it wasn't about me. It wasn't about me finding a way of realizing my own ideas of how to change the world and how to make things happen, and my understanding of participation should come true the way I see them. She was like, there is already so many cool organizations that do excellent work. If you really want that change, you can also fund them. And they will be very happy to get core funding that you give them in a trustworthy relationship setup where you navigate the boundaries that this relationship might need, but also the freedom that you can grant as a private donor that so many organizations lack with the classical hierarchical donor pattern. It's one of the best things anyone has ever said to me, that nobody needed me in this thing to be particular or to be outstanding, but that instead a place of actual solidarity, which meant understanding of what the work was that was done and empathy for those doing it, was much more needed. And so, yes, this got me into becoming a funder of the Greer Foundation, one of many people helping to shape the discussion around how to fund properly, how to fundraise properly, alongside learning from an activist council and how the actual work and the frontline work can be done, should be done, what the needs are, what the struggles are, what the actual questions are, and how to continuously challenge my privilege, my power, and also my role. And so, yeah, there's different entry points, I guess, into all of this. But all of what I said holds are questions of, do I do things privately only or publicly? Do I want participatory or top-down grant-making schemes? How much is enough? What is systems change? What is my role in it? And does my role limit itself to giving money and saying what to do? So today, when I prepared, and I'm going to be done rather soonish so that we can start discussing more, I asked myself again, what is my role? What am I doing? What are my privilege and power patterns? And what does this have to do with my redistributive work? And I wrote down whiteness, wealth, class privilege. I'm able-bodied, and I am rather good at speaking publicly, something that I figured out quickly when I did media work. So I speak as I should. I know the soft skills. I can enter every room as if I own it. My wealth is a power that creates realities. So I can never not ask myself how to make the people affected by the realities I create become part of the decision-making process. So my role is not only to redistribute wealth, but also to fundraise other wealthy people, to raise awareness around this issue, to talk about tax justice, frankly, in the public spaces that are given to me and granted me without me having to ask for them, really. To hold up a mirror to privileged people, not because I want to tell them, look at how bad you are because you're privileged. It's not about judging, but about saying, I have all of these issues too, and these are ways of going about to handle them, or else the comfort zone of not addressing these issues will block the space where the change should actually happen and the magic can happen. So yeah, I felt reinforced again that I chose to not take the decision of my redistribution alone, to put it in the hands of people at the Guerilla Foundation, but also, for instance, the Guter Rat für Rückverteilung, a citizens' assembly, where 10,000 addresses were randomly selected from the Central Registry for Addresses by an organization who can do that kind of work, Foresight Institute, in order to find volunteers who would be willing to participate in citizens' assembly in order to then discuss how wealth is distributed in Austria in general and what to do with excess wealth in order to address that. And it was an extremely participatory, low threshold process where just random people who live in Austria could participate and distribute money, take actual decisions, affect realities, and juggle these questions that I hold with having very, very, very different backgrounds, and thus bringing into this decision-making the experience of knowing that this will affect their lives, which made this process so cool, because so much of the redistribution at the end, everybody was focusing on the 77 organizations picked by the 50 people in the assembly. But it made the process so interesting because it became visible that you need a lot of inclusivity work, like interpreters for people who didn't speak German. You needed a lot of interpreters within the German language itself, where the scientists had to talk to the facilitators and hold their presentations so that they could be corrected according to how difficult they were phrased, so that people could actually have a chance of understanding the input that they got, so that it would be in a language that was accessible. Like all sorts of questions of accessibility were brought to the public attention. And it was never about just giving away money or being the most efficient about this, but about sending a message that things can be done differently in a democratic and solidarity akin spirit, and not in the spirit of hubris that usually comes with grant making. The hubris that you can buy yourself an outcome, that you can measure it, that the metrics are so important, that the result is what you need to go for, that the solutionism and the saviorism you hold in your case is better than the solutionism and the saviorism everybody else holds, because you have understood it a little better than everybody else. Let's not kid ourselves. This arrogance of the well-off is so well-meaning, but it's not helpful. And so, yeah, how can this extremely unscientific approach and selfish approach, because we know that it works better if we have participatory processes. So it's unscientific to believe that your own idea might be the best one if you're a wealthy person. If you're a funder, you're in a particularly sandwich struggle position because you have to deal with the donors' wishes and with the grantees' needs. So that's not easy, I suppose. I can't talk to you from a position of experience. So to all of you, I'm very sorry if some of these things don't resonate more than from the level of donors who could fall into these patterns. But we know how change in society is done. We know that we will probably never see the outcomes that we wish for, because that's what social movement means, that you might not see what needs to happen, and that you can't count and measure it. But also the question of, is it about yourself or is it about the bigger idea, and how much of you has to step aside in order to be in line with the solidarity praxis? All of these questions, to hold them is difficult, but important. And in case you'd be interested in knowing the essay that helped me to this day to figure out most of the time if what I do is done in any way done properly, it's The Master's Tools by Audre Lorde. It's 2.5 pages, a PDF online, you can find it. And it basically tells you, in order to change a system of oppression, you can't use tools of oppression. That's a basic thing I pull out of it. Obviously, she's much better at saying it and writing it. But it also means that discomfort is something that accompanies creativity of finding new solutions and in grant-making ideas and how to radicalize it. I think taking a plunge into waters where you can't really know how deep they are might sometimes be a more interesting approach than to think that you can control every step of the way. And so, yeah, I'll leave you with that for the moment, and then we'll get into the discussion. And I'm really curious to see where it leads us.
Thank you for the articulation. As always, Marlene, I would just add a quick extension, perhaps, about, because you you are in different spaces. And since this is like the pathways to Philanthro-Radicalisation, you did already touch on several different ones. If there is some sort of relational difference in the quality of experiences you have in the tax justice space versus the guerrilla space versus the impact investing space, as a sort of insight, a behavioral insight, perhaps, on how people within these circles conceive of power or philanthropy itself.
Yeah, very interesting. With the tax discussion, you usually have people who are very output driven, outcome driven in terms of, is the government good enough to get the money? Am I not the better one to decide on these things? The focus is so outwardly oriented that it becomes such a blur what the internal parts are. And at the end of the day, we're talking about like wealth taxation, about models that if you pay the tax of, most models range around 1% wealth tax. If you pay that kind of tax and you can estimate that your revenue on your wealth would be around 7% a year, you will only get 6% a year, which means you can have it both ways, right? It's the only scenario where you can have the cake and eat it too. You can have a wealth tax and get richer, and people are still opposing it. It really shows how people who even think progressively in a lot of different categories politically will resort to absolute conservatism or even reactionary thoughts and ideas and narratives when it's about sharing money. And I think it's important to understand these things and to analyze them. I'm not the person who's very good at doing that, because I think that this ultimately also informs philanthropic practices. Philanthropy, however, it's a lot about the inward things, like how can I make myself feel like I do the proper thing and save, help, support the causes that are closest to my heart, but also always remain feeling safe. Like this feeling of safety, anxieties of not having enough, anxieties of making mistakes. And spoiler alert, you will make mistakes. And whenever you give someone money, you might find someone. I call that a learning grant. And there's no such a thing as one unique learning grant. It's several learning grants. And it happens in the worst case scenario is really that you've given people money that they worst case spend on being able to continue to lead their lives, which I think is never a bad thing to do. It's always worth to support it. So the mistake lies in not doing anything, not in funding the wrong group. But at the end of the day, it's so interesting in both cases about giving away money, but one is so outwardly oriented, the political discussion around if the government is good enough, while the other one is about a lot of the internal issues, although it does touch on to questions of, are the grantees good enough? But it's less abstract. It's much more concrete, I feel, in grant making stories. So yeah, those are two differences. And also taxes, usually this is a public discussion, while giving away money for grant making through philanthropy remains extremely private, usually. Like it's very intransparent. It's not discussed publicly. Like there's not a huge discussion in the media that I would know of about how philanthropists do their philanthropy. It just doesn't happen. People don't talk about that, even though there is usually praise that they do philanthropy, but very abstract. So yeah, I hope this covers the question.
And my final thing before turning off the recording and opening it up to everyone is two shades of personal experience of your journey. One being the public attention that was received. How has that been? Because that's also, I think, a big obstacle to transparency and to openness within the wealth class, even for those who are willing to be more open or to redistribute wealth. And the other being the actual practice of redistribution. How does it sit? How has it landed? The aftermath of it.
Yeah. So public attention is something that I understand that people are very careful with. But As a rich person speaking out for tax justice, I have mostly received excellent public attention. The only ones who don't like that are people who are working for the lobby, the wealth defense industry, other wealthy people who think I must be an idiot, and the occasional person who tries to reach out to then tell me that I haven't understood it and now they have to explain to me because obviously I haven't analyzed anything, which I think is the most interesting reaction because it's the blindness for your own arrogance. Well, those people make me laugh. So that's that. At the same time, public attention is also very draining. It's overwhelming. It's all over the place. And what happens is you get confronted with a lot of narratives, and the more you challenge a status quo, that's my experience, the worse the attention becomes because it gets into a defensive mode. And with the philanthropy, the fact that I would redistribute such amounts, I mean, it was 25 million euros that this assembly could redistribute. At first, everybody is super excited about it. First public reaction is excitement. But then immediately goes into, does she know what she's doing? Aren't there more efficient ways? We don't even know yet. Like the process and the project have not even started yet. Immediately it's being put into question, and not questions of curiosity, but questions of how to judge it properly as fast as possible. It's not about finding things out. It's not about reporting properly. It's about judging. And it's such a lack of interest comes from wanting to judge because you're so focused on the result. You either need to judge it properly as it's good or bad, and then be able to brag about having judged it properly when you have an actual outcome and result, which really makes sure that nobody really gets into asking questions of how is the process set up? How does it make sense, not in terms of to be able to judge it as good, but to see, is this what participation can look like or should look like? And what's the difference between those two? What does inclusivity and accessibility really mean? Is this a democratic process or is it not? There was a question around this. I mean, a citizens' assembly, which is it's a democratic tool, and people were not sure whether it was democratic because I'm not an elected official. I'm like, that's not what this is about. It doesn't matter whether I'm an elected official or not, because when a ministry, for instance, Ministry for Climate in Austria had a climate assembly, when they decide there is a citizens' assembly, nobody gets to decide other than the ministry. And they're not elected as a minister. They are elected as a member of parliament at best. They might not even have been elected as a member of parliament, but have been chosen by the party who got enough votes to choose people to put to parliament. So the questions of who, like the change of who's in charge and how democracy actually works, there was a lack of understanding in it. And the fact that the process itself in the assembly was democratic, my electedness or not elected, like my mandate, if you will. Very, very weird. So public discourse takes weird turns so easily, and it loves to stick with them because nothing is worse than having to change the topic. And then finally, what I have experienced is it was received extremely well, all of it. All things considered, there was wonky stuff, there was weird stuff. People tried to discredit it, but you couldn't discredit the Citizens' Assembly without discrediting democratic processes, which made a lot of people remain silent, which is usually the best way of dodging a public conversation. I got enormous amounts of praise. I still get them to this day, which is also problematic because the people who made the decision were the members of the assembly, not me. I didn't choose any of these 77 organizations, and yet they sent me emails with thank you notes. And I'm like, you don't know if I would have picked you. You don't know if I would have known you. I might have never had heard of you. And yet. So yeah, it's, as many things, a double-edged sword. But I think public attention is not, the question is, do you do it for yourself or do you do it for the cause? And if you're able to navigate this question, it becomes interesting because public attention is such a good tool for transparency issues and reasons, and for narratives and for storytelling and for being able to own your project and stand behind it and say, yes, these are the exact mistakes we made and now everybody knows them, so nobody has to make them again. They can make their own mistakes. And not to see it as a stand where you have a judge who will then rule over you. If you understand publicity as this space, then you bar yourself from the opportunity of actually entering into discourse even if at the beginning it might not be comfortable, even if it will never become comfortable, and even if it becomes more and more uncomfortable, which is usually a good way of knowing that either you're completely wrong and about to join QAnon, or that you're so right that people feel challenged deeply within themselves just because you're there, because your mere presence, even just like through an article in a newspaper, challenges assumptions, challenges the status quo. So I would say whoever takes their work seriously should consider this arena very, very thoroughly, because it's powerful and it's tricky. And the more we are in there in this discussion, discourse, the better we can navigate it all together.
I don't think I could come up with better concluding remarks for the input section. Thank you very much, Ms. Engelhorn.
Thank you, Ivan, much.